Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez had completed 4 combat deployments across Iraq and Syria, earning commendations for tactical excellence and battlefield adaptability. Her squad leaders consistently rated her as competent, but lacks the aggressive leadership presence required for primary operations. On March 8th, when an entire 12-man reconnaissance unit was pinned down in hostile territory with 0 extraction options, Elena would infiltrate enemy lines alone and bring home every single soldier that Central Command had written off as casualties. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of burning fuel across forward operating base Sentinel as Elena adjusted her plate carrier for what felt like the 100th time. That morning, around her, Alpha Company's finest prepared for high-priority missions with the confident efficiency that had made them legendary throughout the special operations community. But Elena wasn't gearing up alongside her teammates. She stood at the perimeter fence, watching through chain link as other soldiers loaded into helicopters bound for operations she should have been leading. Captain Michael Torres emerged from the Tactical Operations Center, his desert camouflage uniform bearing the crisp lines that somehow remained perfect despite the harsh conditions of eastern Syria. He surveyed the staging area with the calculating assessment of someone who had spent 12 years transforming raw recruits into elite warriors. When his gaze found Elena, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly from professional evaluation to something resembling concern mixed with disappointment. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the concrete barriers and sandbag fortifications that defined their temporary home in this contested region. Elena had walked these same paths countless times over the past 8 months, memorizing every defensive position, every sight line, every potential weakness that might be exploited by the various militia groups operating in the area. Her tactical knowledge of the base layout was encyclopedic, but that expertise had never translated into the kind of leadership opportunities her male counterparts took for granted. Other soldiers moved past her with the purposeful urgency of people who knew their value was recognized and their contributions essential. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez checked his weapon systems with the methodical precision of someone preparing for immediate deployment. Sergeant First Class David Kim reviewed digital maps on his tablet, plotting routes through terrain he would actually be allowed to navigate. Specialist James Morrison secured equipment loads that Elena had helped design, but would never be permitted to carry into the field. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had become invisible in an environment where invisibility was supposedly valued as a tactical asset. After 8 months of proving her capabilities through every metric the military used to evaluate soldier performance, Elena had somehow achieved the paradoxical status of being simultaneously indispensable and overlooked. Her input was sought during mission planning sessions, but her name never appeared on deployment rosters. Her tactical assessments were valued enough to influence operational decisions, but never trusted enough to put her in positions where those assessments could be implemented. Captain Torres approached with the measured stride of someone delivering news he'd rather avoid. Elena could read the reluctance in his posture, the way his shoulders carried the weight of institutional decisions that conflicted with his personal assessment of her abilities. She'd seen this expression before, during conversations that invariably began with praise for her competence and ended with explanations about why that competence wasn't quite sufficient for advancement. The staging area continued its choreographed preparation around them as Torres reached her position. Helicopters wound up their engines in the distance, creating a backdrop of mechanical urgency that emphasized the fact that Elena would not be boarding any of those aircraft. The sound had become a daily reminder of opportunities that remained perpetually just beyond her reach, no matter how thoroughly she demonstrated her readiness. "Vasquez, we need to talk," Torres called out, his voice carrying the official tone that always preceded conversations Elena had learned to dread. She followed him toward a quieter section of the compound, away from the organized chaos of mission preparation, toward the kind of private space where careers were redirected and dreams were officially postponed. The captain's office was a study in functional efficiency, with maps covering every available wall space and communication equipment that connected their remote outpost to command structures spanning 3 continents. Elena had been in this room dozens of times for briefings, debriefings, and the kind of informal consultations that acknowledged her expertise while stopping short of granting her the authority to act on that knowledge. The familiar environment felt different today, charged with the tension that preceded significant changes. Torres settled behind his desk without the usual offer for Elena to sit, a subtle indication that this conversation would be brief and not particularly collaborative. She remained standing, maintaining the military bearing that had become second nature after 8 years of service, but her mind raced through possible explanations for this summons. Recent operations had proceeded without significant complications. Her performance evaluations remained consistently excellent. Her relationship with other squad members showed no signs of tension or conflict. "I've been reviewing your personnel file again," Torres began, his eyes focused on documents rather than making direct contact with Elena. "Your technical skills are exceptional. Your marksmanship scores rank in the top 5% of the entire battalion. Your physical fitness ratings exceed standards for combat operations, and your tactical knowledge consistently impresses senior staff during planning sessions." Elena felt a familiar mixture of hope and apprehension. Conversations that began with detailed recitations of her qualifications had historically led to conclusions that somehow negated all those positive attributes. The praise felt like preparation for disappointment, like the verbal equivalent of softening a blow that was about to land with devastating impact. "Your performance during the Raqqa operation was particularly noteworthy," Torres continued, still avoiding eye contact. "The intelligence you gathered during that reconnaissance mission prevented what could have been a catastrophic encounter with superior enemy forces. Your cultural awareness and linguistic capabilities proved invaluable during interactions with local population groups. Several senior officers specifically mentioned your contributions in their after-action reports." The office felt smaller with each word of commendation, as if the walls were closing in to contain praise that would ultimately be qualified by institutional limitations Elena had encountered throughout her career. She'd learned to recognize this pattern: meticulous documentation of her achievements, followed by explanations about why those achievements weren't quite sufficient for the next level of responsibility. "Ma'am, if this is about the Talafar incident review, I've already submitted my comprehensive report," Elena said, attempting to anticipate whatever criticism might be approaching. "The civilian casualty assessment was conducted according to established protocols, and my recommendations were implemented without modification." "It's not about Talafar," Torres replied, finally looking up from the documents. "Your handling of that situation was exemplary. The local tribal leaders specifically requested future operations include your participation because of the trust you'd established with their communities. That kind of cultural bridge building is exactly what we need more of in this operational environment." Elena's confusion deepened. If her recent performance had been exemplary and her skills were valued by both military leadership and local partners, what could possibly justify another conversation about her limitations? She'd checked every box the military used to evaluate readiness for increased responsibility, exceeding every standard that supposedly determined advancement potential. The helicopter engines outside reached full power, their roar temporarily drowning out the possibility of conversation. Through the office window, Elena could see the aircraft lifting off, carrying soldiers toward missions where her absence would be felt but not acknowledged. The timing felt symbolic, another reminder that despite her qualifications and contributions, She remained grounded while others flew toward opportunities she was deemed unsuitable to pursue. "The issue isn't your individual performance," Torres said once the helicopter noise faded. "It's about team dynamics and the kind of leadership, presence that inspires confidence in high-stress combat situations. When other soldiers look at their squad leader, they need to see someone who projects the kind of authority that makes enemies think twice about engaging and allies feel secure about following orders into dangerous territory." The words landed with the familiar sting of institutional bias dressed up as operational necessity. Elena had heard variations of this explanation throughout her career, always delivered with the careful language of people who understood they were walking close to the line of discrimination, but believed they remained on the acceptable side of that boundary. The maintenance bay hummed with the constant activity of soldiers, preparing equipment for operations Elena would never be cleared to join. She moved methodically through her assigned tasks, checking communication systems and updating inventory logs while watching real operators finalize preparations for missions that would test everything she'd trained to handle. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in the same sterile glow that made coffee taste metallic and ambition feel like a luxury she couldn't afford in her current position. Elena had earned her place at Forward Operating Base Sentinel through 8 years of flawless service that began with basic training scores in the 99th percentile and continued through multiple deployments where her performance consistently exceeded expectations. Her marksmanship instructor at Fort Benning had described her shooting as poetry in motion, noting that she could maintain sub-minute accuracy even after hours of physical exhaustion. Her language instructors praised her fluency in Arabic and Kurdish, skills that had proven invaluable during cultural liaison missions throughout Iraq and Syria. During her first deployment, Elena had volunteered for every dangerous assignment, every reconnaissance mission, every opportunity to prove that her slight frame and quiet demeanor masked capabilities that rivaled any soldier in her unit. She'd spent countless hours studying tactical manuals, memorizing regional geography, and developing the kind of cultural awareness that transformed potentially hostile encounters into cooperative intelligence gathering opportunities. Her approach to military service was methodical and comprehensive, leaving nothing to chance and no skill undeveloped. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on Elena as she updated equipment manifests that other soldiers would carry into combat zones she'd mapped and analyzed in exhaustive detail. Her tactical assessments hung on planning room walls, her cultural insights influenced operational decisions, and her linguistic skills had prevented diplomatic incidents that could have escalated into full-scale conflicts. Yet somehow, none of these contributions translated into the kind of leadership opportunities that seemed to flow naturally to her male colleagues. Sergeant First Class Martinez approached with a tablet displaying mission parameters for an operation Elena had helped design but wouldn't be allowed to execute. His expression carried the awkward mixture of respect and pity that characterized how most of her colleagues interacted with her these days. They recognized her expertise and valued her contributions, but they also understood that institutional limitations prevented her from advancing beyond her current support role. "Vasquez, I need you to verify the communication protocols for tomorrow's patrol," Martinez said, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating a situation he didn't fully understand, but knew enough to handle delicately. "Your frequency assignments and backup procedures are solid, but Torres wants triple confirmation on everything before we step off." Elena accepted the tablet and reviewed protocols she'd written herself, checking details she could recite from memory against specifications that hadn't changed since her last review 3 days earlier. The redundant verification process was symptomatic of how her expertise was simultaneously valued and questioned. Trusted enough to influence planning, but not enough to eliminate supervisory oversight that no male colleague endured. "Everything looks accurate," Elena reported after completing her review. Primary frequencies are clean, backup channels are confirmed available, and emergency protocols follow standard operating procedures. Communication windows are synchronized with Overwatch. Schedules and all equipment has been tested within the last 48 hours. Martinez nodded and retrieved his tablet, but his hesitation suggested there was more to the conversation than simple protocol verification. Elena had learned to recognize this pattern among her colleagues, the way they approached her with professional requests that masked personal discomfort about her marginalized status within the unit's hierarchy. "Look, Vasquez," Martinez said quietly, glancing around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard by passing personnel. "I don't understand why you're not leading these missions yourself. Your tactical knowledge is better than half the team leaders in this company, and your performance record speaks for itself. The whole situation doesn't make sense from where I'm sitting." Elena appreciated Martinez's acknowledgement of the institutional disconnect between her capabilities and her assignments, but she'd learned that discussing these contradictions with colleagues only highlighted problems she couldn't solve and they couldn't address. The military's decision-making process regarding her career advancement operated according to criteria that weren't openly acknowledged and couldn't be directly challenged through normal channels. "I appreciate the sentiment, Martinez, but this conversation isn't going to change anything," Elena replied. "The decision-making process operates above our pay grade, and questioning it isn't going to benefit either of us professionally. Focus on your mission tomorrow. The protocols are solid, and your team is well prepared." The maintenance bay continued its steady rhythm around them as other soldiers moved through pre-deployment checklists that had become routine over months of constant operational tempo. Elena recognized most of the faces and could recite the specialties and capabilities of every person preparing for missions she monitored from the operations center. Her knowledge of personnel capabilities was encyclopedic, but that knowledge existed in service of organizing operations she would never lead. "Staff." Sergeant Kim paused at Elena's workstation with a requisition form that required her authorization before equipment could be assigned to his squad. The paperwork was straightforward administrative procedure, but Kim's expression suggested he shared Martinez's confusion about Elena's relegation to support duties, despite her obvious qualifications. "For field leadership, I'm requesting the advanced communication package for our movement tomorrow," Kim said, placing the form on Elena's desk. "We're expecting to operate in areas where standard radio systems might not provide adequate coverage, and your communication analysis suggested we'd need enhanced capability for this particular route." Elena reviewed the requisition and signed her approval, noting that Kim's squad would be carrying equipment she'd recommended based on terrain analysis she'd conducted, using satellite imagery and topographical data. Her strategic thinking influenced every aspect of the mission, from route selection to equipment allocation, but her physical presence would be limited to monitoring radio traffic from the relative safety of the operations center. "The enhanced package should give you full coverage throughout your area of operations," Elena confirmed. "I've programmed backup frequencies that account for atmospheric conditions and potential interference from industrial facilities in the region. Your communication windows with base are optimized for your movement schedule and should provide consistent contact throughout the mission." Kim accepted the signed requisition but remained at Elena's workstation, his posture suggesting the same uncomfortable awareness that characterized most of her interactions with field personnel. They recognized her expertise and depended on her tactical input, but they also understood that some invisible barrier prevented her from translating that expertise into field leadership opportunities. The contradiction was particularly evident during mission briefings where Elena's analysis shaped operational decisions while she sat in the back of the room, contributing expertise without authority, influencing strategy without commanding implementation. Her colleagues had learned to value her input while accepting that Institutional dynamics they couldn't fully explain kept her confined to advisory roles. "Vasquez, I've worked with a lot of tactical analysts over the years," Kim said quietly. "Your understanding of terrain and enemy capabilities is better than most officers I've served under. The fact that you're not leading operations doesn't make sense to anyone who's paying attention to performance rather than politics." Elena had heard similar observations from colleagues throughout her career, expressions of bewilderment that her qualifications didn't translate into advancement opportunities. The pattern was consistent across different units and different commands, suggesting systemic rather than localized barriers that operated according to criteria that were never explicitly stated but consistently applied. "Kim, I appreciate the confidence, but this conversation isn't productive for either of us," Elena said. "Your mission tomorrow requires focus on execution rather than personnel policy debates. Trust your training, follow the protocols we've established, and bring everyone home safely. That's what matters." The equipment bay gradually emptied as soldiers completed their preparations and moved toward final briefings that would occur without Elena's direct participation. She would monitor their progress through communication intercepts and satellite feeds, providing support from a distance while they implemented strategies she'd helped develop. The separation between planning and execution had become the defining characteristic of her military service. Captain Torres's voice echoed through the compound's public address system, calling team leaders to the briefing room for final mission. Coordination. Elena wasn't included in the summons despite her intimate knowledge of every aspect of tomorrow's operation. Her exclusion from leadership meetings had become so routine that she barely registered the announcement, focusing instead on completing equipment checks that other soldiers would depend on for their survival. The Tactical Operations Center buzzed with the controlled intensity that preceded complex missions, but Elena found herself assigned to a workstation in the far corner, monitoring communication frequencies while senior staff coordinated operations she'd helped design. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hammond entered the briefing room with the commanding presence that came from 15 years of transforming strategic objectives into successful field operations. Her uniform bore the subdued insignia that marked her as someone whose decisions affected hundreds of lives across multiple theaters of operation. Hammond's reputation preceded her through every conversation in the special operations community. She'd earned her position through a combination of tactical brilliance and political acumen that had navigated her through the complex dynamics of military advancement in an environment where female officers faced scrutiny that their male counterparts never encountered. Her success had come at the cost of maintaining strict adherence to institutional expectations and avoiding any appearance of favoritism toward other women who might be perceived as challenging traditional hierarchies. Elena watched through the glass partition as Hammond reviewed mission parameters with team leaders who would execute plans Elena had spent weeks developing. The irony was particularly sharp today because the operation involved cultural liaison work that directly utilized skills Elena had demonstrated repeatedly throughout her deployments. Her linguistic capabilities and cultural awareness had proven invaluable during previous missions, but somehow those same skills weren't deemed sufficient to warrant field leadership opportunities. The briefing room represented everything Elena aspired to, but remained excluded from achieving. Maps covered every available wall surface, displaying terrain she'd analyzed in exhaustive detail. Communication equipment connected the room to assets spanning 3 countries, facilitating coordination that Elena understood better than most of the personnel authorized to use it. Digital displays showed real-time intelligence feeds that Elena monitored but wasn't permitted to interpret for operational decision-making. Hammond's voice carried clearly through the operations center as she addressed team leaders with the crisp authority that had made her legendary among junior officers who studied her career trajectory as a model for their own advancement. Elena had attempted to emulate Hammond's approach, maintaining flawless performance standards while avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as challenging institutional norms or questioning established hierarchies. Today's operation requires precision execution and cultural sensitivity, Hammond announced to the assembled team leaders. Intelligence indicates we'll be operating in areas where local population cooperation could determine mission success or failure. Your approach to civilian interactions will be critical for achieving our strategic objectives without creating long-term complications for future operations. Elena felt the familiar frustration of watching others receive credit for implementing strategies she developed. Her cultural analysis had identified the specific tribal dynamics that would influence local cooperation. Her linguistic skills had enabled previous successful negotiations with community leaders who remained suspicious of American military presence. Her understanding of regional politics had shaped the diplomatic approach that would determine whether today's mission succeeded or failed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand to ask about population density estimates in the target area. Elena had compiled those estimates using satellite imagery and demographic data, creating detailed analyses that accounted for seasonal migration patterns and economic factors that influenced civilian movement. Her work was comprehensive and accurate, but Rodriguez would receive the information without any acknowledgement of Elena's contribution to its development. Population density varies significantly based on agricultural cycles and market schedules, Hammond replied, reading from reports Elena had authored. Current estimates suggest approximately 200 civilians in the immediate area of operations, with concentrations around the main marketplace and religious facilities. Your approach should account for increased civilian presence during morning and evening hours when commercial activity peaks. The information was accurate because Elena had spent countless hours analyzing patterns that most soldiers never considered, but that could determine whether missions succeeded or created diplomatic incidents with lasting consequences. Her attention to cultural details had prevented misunderstandings that could have escalated into conflicts, but her contributions remained invisible to the team leaders who would benefit from her analysis. Lieutenant Morrison asked about communication protocols for interacting with local tribal leaders. Elena had developed those protocols based on her understanding of traditional hierarchy structures and the specific diplomatic language that demonstrated respect for local authority while maintaining American operational security. Her protocols had proven successful during previous missions, but Morrison would implement them without understanding their cultural foundation. Communication protocols follow established procedures for acknowledging tribal authority while maintaining operational flexibility, Hammond explained, again reading from Elena's reports. Initial contact should emphasize respect for local customs and recognition of traditional leadership structures. Avoid any language that could be interpreted as threatening or dismissive of community concerns about foreign military presence. Elena watched Morrison take notes on guidance she'd written, knowing that his success or failure would depend partly on his ability to understand cultural nuances that couldn't be fully conveyed through written protocols. Her physical presence during the mission could provide real-time cultural guidance that might prevent misunderstandings, but institutional limitations kept her confined to monitoring duties rather than field leadership. The briefing continued, with discussions of tactical contingencies and emergency procedures that Elena had helped develop but wouldn't be authorized to implement. Her expertise influenced every aspect of the mission planning, from route selection to equipment allocation, but her role remained limited to providing support from the operations center while others executed strategies she'd created. Hammond's presentation covered threat assessments that incorporated Elena's analysis of local militia capabilities and likely response patterns. Elena had studied the regional security environment extensively, identifying potential threats and developing countermeasures that accounted for terrain advantages and local knowledge that insurgent groups possessed. Her threat analysis was thorough, and accurate, but the team leaders receiving this information had no direct access to her expertise if situations developed beyond predicted parameters. Specialist. Chun asked about backup communication procedures if primary systems failed during the mission. Elena had designed those backup procedures based on her understanding of local atmospheric conditions and potential interference from industrial facilities in the region. Her communication planning accounted for multiple contingencies that could disrupt standard radio protocols, but Chun would implement her procedures without understanding their technical foundation. Backup communication protocols include alternative frequencies and relay procedures that account for terrain obstacles and potential interference. Hammond replied, referencing Elena's technical specifications. Emergency communication windows are established at 2-hour intervals, with predetermined fallback positions that provide optimal transmission conditions if standard protocols fail. The technical details were complex because Elena had anticipated multiple failure scenarios and developed redundant systems that maintained communication capability under adverse conditions. Her planning was comprehensive and professional, but the soldiers who would depend on her communication systems had no direct access to her technical expertise if problems developed during implementation. Hammond concluded the briefing with reminders about mission objectives and success criteria that reflected Elena's strategic thinking about long-term consequences of tactical decisions. Elena had emphasized the importance of maintaining positive relationships with local communities while achieving immediate military objectives, understanding that today's actions would influence future operational environments. As team leaders filed out of the briefing room to begin final preparations, Elena remained at her monitoring station, watching others prepare to execute missions she designed but wouldn't be allowed to lead. The separation between planning and implementation had become the defining characteristic of her military service, creating a professional existence where her expertise was valued, but her leadership potential remained unrecognized at the operations center settled into the focused quiet that preceded mission execution. Elena adjusted her communication equipment and reviewed monitoring protocols she'd established for tracking team progress throughout the day. Her role would be limited to observing and supporting from a distance, while others implemented strategies that might succeed or fail based partly on factors she understood better than anyone else in the compound. The afternoon heat shimmered off the concrete barriers surrounding the operations center as Elena made her way to Lieutenant Colonel Hammond's office, summoned by a message that carried the formal tone she'd learned to associate with career-defining conversations. The corridors buzzed with the controlled energy of ongoing missions, but Elena's attention focused on the upcoming meeting that could determine whether her expertise would ever be translated into field leadership opportunities. Hammond's office reflected the methodical organization of someone who'd successfully navigated 15 years of military advancement while maintaining the political awareness necessary to avoid institutional pitfalls that had derailed other promising careers. Awards and commendations lined the walls, documenting successful operations that had established Hammond's reputation as one of the most effective commanders in special operations. Elena had studied Hammond's career trajectory extensively, recognizing her as a potential mentor who understood the unique challenges faced by women in combat roles. The lieutenant colonel gestured for Elena to take a seat across from her desk, but the formal arrangement of the meeting space suggested this would be a one-sided conversation rather than a collaborative discussion. Elena maintained her military bearing while internally preparing for whatever assessment or redirection was about to be delivered. Her recent performance had been flawless, but she'd learned that excellence didn't guarantee advancement when institutional dynamics operated according to unwritten rules she struggled to understand. Sergeant Vasquez, I've been conducting a comprehensive review of personnel assignments within our operational framework. Hammond began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering carefully rehearsed information. Your technical capabilities are undeniable, and your cultural expertise has proven invaluable during recent missions. However, I need to address some concerns that have emerged regarding your deployment potential for forward operations. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied conversations where her qualifications would be acknowledged before being dismissed for reasons that remained frustratingly vague. She'd participated in dozens of these discussions throughout her career, each following a similar pattern where praise for her abilities preceded explanations about why those abilities weren't quite sufficient for advancement. Ma'am, if this relates to my performance during recent operations, I've consistently exceeded all established metrics for mission success, Elena replied, maintaining professional composure while internally bracing for whatever criticism was approaching. My cultural analysis prevented 3 separate incidents that could have compromised community relations, and my communication protocols maintained perfect contact with all deployed assets. Hammond nodded acknowledgement, but continued with her prepared assessment. Your technical performance is exemplary, Sergeant. The issue isn't your individual capabilities, but rather the broader dynamics of team leadership and the psychological factors that influence combat effectiveness in high-stress environments. When soldiers are operating under extreme pressure, they need to have absolute confidence in their leadership structure. The words carried the familiar sting of institutional bias disguised as operational necessity. Elena had encountered variations of this explanation throughout her career, always delivered by well-meaning officers who believed they were providing constructive feedback while reinforcing systemic barriers that prevented her advancement. Language was careful and politically correct, but the underlying message remained consistent across different commands and different leadership personalities. Ma'am, my leadership has been tested during multiple deployments where my decisions directly affected mission outcomes, Elena said, her voice remaining respectful but firm. The tribal negotiations I conducted in Mosul prevented a potential uprising that could have destabilized the entire region. My tactical decisions during the Kirkuk operation saved lives and achieved strategic objectives that exceeded original mission parameters. Hammond consulted documents on her desk, reviewing performance reports that Elena knew contained uniformly positive evaluations from every superior she'd served under during 8 years of military service. The disconnect between documented performance and advancement opportunities had become a source of constant frustration, particularly when she watched less qualified male colleagues receive promotions she'd been passed over for repeatedly. Your individual achievements are impressive, Sergeant, but military effectiveness depends on more than personal competence, Hammond continued. It requires the ability to project authority that inspires confidence among subordinates and commands, respect from potential adversaries. In combat environments, perception often matters as much as reality when it comes to maintaining unit cohesion and mission focus. Elena recognized the subtext beneath Hammond's carefully chosen words. The lieutenant colonel was suggesting that Elena's gender and physical appearance undermined her ability to command respect in environments where traditional masculine stereotypes remained influential. The assessment was particularly frustrating because it ignored Elena's proven track record of successful leadership under combat conditions. Ma'am, with respect, enemy forces in this region don't base their tactical decisions on the gender of opposing commanders, Elena replied. They respond to competence, preparation, and tactical sophistication. My success rate during direct engagement situations demonstrates that effectiveness isn't determined by appearance or preconceptions about leadership profiles. Hammond's expression shifted slightly, suggesting Elena's response had touched on arguments the lieutenant colonel had considered, but wasn't prepared to acknowledge openly. The institutional dynamics that governed military advancement operated according to unwritten rules that couldn't be directly challenged without risking career consequences that both women understood but couldn't openly discuss. Sergeant, I'm not questioning your personal courage or tactical abilities, Hammond said, her tone becoming more conciliatory. But I have to consider the broader implications of assignment decisions that affect entire teams and mission outcomes. When other soldiers look at their leader, they need to see someone who embodies the kind of authority that has historically proven effective in combat situations. The conversation was approaching the crucial moment where Elena would either accept institutional limitations or challenge assumptions that kept her confined to support roles despite her proven capabilities. She'd reached similar crossroads throughout her career, each time choosing professional diplomacy over confrontation. But the cumulative effect of these compromises had gradually eroded her patience with systemic barriers that seemed impervious to rational argument. "Ma'am, I need to ask a direct question," Elena said, her voice carrying a new edge that reflected years of accumulated frustration. "What specific performance metric could I improve to qualify for field leadership opportunities? What standard exists that I haven't already exceeded? What capability do I lack that my male colleagues possess?" Hammond was quiet for several seconds, clearly recognizing that Elena was demanding explicit criteria rather than accepting vague explanations about leadership presence and team dynamics. The lieutenant colonel's hesitation suggested she understood that honest answers would reveal institutional biases that couldn't be defended through rational argument. "The criteria for advancement aren't solely based on individual performance metrics," Hammond finally replied. "They include subjective assessments of leadership potential that consider factors beyond technical competence. These assessments take into account the complex dynamics of military culture and the practical realities of commanding respect in environments where traditional authority structures remain influential." Elena felt anger building beneath her professional composure as she processed Hammond's admission that advancement decisions were based on subjective criteria rather than objective performance standards. The acknowledgement confirmed what she'd suspected throughout her career, but had never heard explicitly stated by senior leadership. "So my advancement is limited by other people's preconceptions about my capabilities rather than my actual demonstrated performance," Elena said, her voice remaining controlled but carrying unmistakable challenge. "I'm being held responsible for changing institutional culture rather than simply excelling within existing systems." Hammond's discomfort was visible as she realized the conversation had moved beyond safe territory into areas where honest discussion would require acknowledging systemic problems that senior leadership preferred to avoid addressing directly. The lieutenant colonel's position required maintaining institutional loyalty while managing individual personnel concerns that often conflicted with broader organizational priorities. "Sergeant Vasquez, change happens gradually within military institutions," Hammond said, choosing her words carefully. "Your contributions are valued, and your expertise is essential to our operational success. But advancement requires patience and understanding that some barriers take time to overcome through institutional evolution rather than individual confrontation." Elena understood that Hammond was advising her to accept current limitations while hoping that future leadership might be more receptive to recognizing her qualifications. The advice was well-intentioned but required Elena to sacrifice her career ambitions for the possibility that systemic change might eventually create opportunities that didn't currently exist. The reassignment order arrived the following morning. With the impersonal efficiency that characterized military bureaucracy at its most devastating, Elena stared at the document that officially transferred her from tactical operations to intelligence analysis. Effective immediately, the new position carried the same rank and pay grade, but stripped away every responsibility that had made her previous assignment meaningful. She would spend her days compiling reports about missions she'd never participate in, analyzing intelligence that others would act upon, and watching from the sidelines as less qualified personnel implemented strategies she could execute more effectively. The Intelligence Analysis Division occupied a windowless building on the far side of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, isolated from the operational centers where real decisions were made and actual missions were coordinated. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in the same sterile glow that made time feel suspended and ambition seem pointless. Elena's new workstation consisted of a computer terminal, a filing cabinet, and a desk positioned far from any windows, where she might catch glimpses of soldiers preparing for operations she'd been deemed unsuitable to lead. Major Stephen Walsh presided over the intelligence division with the methodical detachment of someone who'd built his career through administrative competence rather than field experience. He'd spent the majority of his military service in climate-controlled offices, analyzing data collected by soldiers who actually engaged with the complexities he studied from a distance. His interactions with Elena carried the casual authority of someone who believed that desk work represented the natural progression for personnel who couldn't advance within operational commands. "Vasquez, I need you to review these satellite intelligence reports and update our database with any significant tactical developments," Walsh announced from his office doorway, his voice carrying the routine indifference of someone assigning tasks he considered appropriate for Elena's reduced status. "Focus on identifying patterns that might influence future operational planning, but understand that your analysis will be reviewed by senior staff before any recommendations are forwarded to command." Elena accepted the assignment while internally processing the implications of her new role. She would be analyzing intelligence about regions she'd operated in personally, identifying threats she'd encountered directly, and making recommendations based on experience that exceeded most of the personnel who would review her work. The irony was overwhelming, but she maintained professional composure while adapting to her diminished circumstances. The intelligence reports contained information about tribal dynamics in areas where Elena had conducted successful negotiations, threat assessments for regions where she'd established valuable community relationships, and cultural analysis that relied on insights she'd developed through direct interaction with local populations. Her intimate knowledge of these environments made the analytical work almost insulting in its simplicity, like asking a surgeon to read medical textbooks instead of performing operations. Other analysts in the division treated Elena with polite curiosity tinged with professional sympathy. They recognized her background in operational roles and understood that her transfer represented a significant career setback, but none of them seemed particularly interested in understanding the circumstances that had led to her reassignment. To them, she was simply another capable soldier who'd failed to advance within the competitive hierarchy of special operations. Specialist Jennifer Park worked at the terminal adjacent to Elena's, processing communications intercepts with the methodical patience of someone who'd never experienced the adrenaline rush of field operations. Her technical skills were competent, but her analysis lacked the contextual understanding that came from personal experience with the cultures and environments she studied. Elena found herself instinctively wanting to provide insights that could improve Park's assessments, but her new role discouraged such collaboration. These intercepts from the Anbar region are showing increased activity around tribal meeting sites, Park mentioned during one of their few conversations. "The pattern suggests some kind of coordinated planning, but I can't determine whether it's related to agricultural scheduling or potential security concerns. The cultural context isn't clear from the communications alone." Elena knew immediately that the increased activity related to seasonal dispute resolution processes that tribal leaders conducted annually to address territorial disagreements and resource allocation issues. Her understanding came from direct participation in similar meetings during previous deployments, but providing that insight would require explaining knowledge that exceeded her current authorization level. "Have you consulted cultural reference materials about traditional tribal governance cycles?" Elena asked, offering guidance that stopped short of revealing her personal familiarity with the processes Park was attempting to understand. "Seasonal Patterns often influence community activities in ways that aren't immediately obvious from communication intercepts alone. Park's expression suggested she appreciated the guidance, but didn't fully grasp the depth of knowledge Elena was carefully avoiding revealing. The interaction highlighted Elena's frustrating position of possessing expertise she wasn't authorized to fully utilize while watching colleagues struggle with problems she could solve effortlessly. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper represented the kind of officer Elena had once hoped to become, someone whose tactical knowledge and field experience translated into analytical responsibilities that influenced operational planning. His insights were valued by senior staff, his recommendations shaped mission parameters, and his career trajectory suggested steady advancement toward command positions. Elena studied his approach while recognizing that similar advancement remained unavailable to her despite comparable qualifications. Vasquez, I've been reviewing your analysis of the Northwestern Corridor security situation, Cooper said, approaching her workstation with documents that contained her assessment of threats in areas she'd operated in extensively. Your understanding of tribal territorial dynamics is remarkably detailed. This level of cultural insight usually requires years of regional experience to develop. Elena felt the familiar tension of needing to deflect attention from capabilities that exceeded her current role's expectations. Her analysis was detailed because she'd personally negotiated with the tribal leaders whose territory she'd assessed, but acknowledging that experience would raise questions about why someone with her background was assigned to basic analytical duties. I've spent considerable time studying regional cultural patterns, sir, Elena replied, choosing words that were technically accurate while avoiding specifics that might complicate her situation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Understanding local dynamics is essential for accurate threat assessment, regardless of whether that understanding comes from academic study or field observation. Cooper nodded approvingly, but his expression suggested he suspected Elena's knowledge came from sources more substantial than academic research. The interaction created another layer of professional complexity, where Elena needed to demonstrate competence while avoiding recognition that might expose the institutional failures that had led to her reassignment. The daily routine of intelligence analysis gradually became a form of professional purgatory, where Elena's expertise was simultaneously valued and wasted. She compiled reports about regions she'd operated in, analyzed threats she'd encountered personally, and made recommendations based on experience that far exceeded most of the personnel who reviewed her work. The disconnect between her capabilities and her assignments created a constant source of frustration that she struggled to manage professionally. Major Walsh's management style emphasized procedural compliance over analytical innovation, creating an environment where Elena's insights were filtered through bureaucratic processes that diluted their impact and delayed their implementation. Her recommendations were reviewed, revised, and forwarded through channels that removed her personal expertise from the final products that reached operational planners. The intelligence division's isolation from operational centers meant that Elena rarely encountered the soldiers who might benefit from her analysis, creating a professional disconnect that made her work feel abstract and ineffective. She'd transitioned from direct involvement in mission success to indirect support that felt increasingly meaningless as weeks passed without significant recognition of her contributions. Evening hours found Elena in her quarters, reviewing personal notes from deployments that had defined her identity as a soldier and leader. The contrast between her previous responsibilities and her current assignments created a sense of professional exile that challenged her fundamental understanding of military service and personal worth. She dedicated 8 years to becoming an exceptional soldier, only to discover that excellence wasn't sufficient to overcome institutional barriers that operated according to criteria she couldn't influence or fully understand, the crisis began. At 0347 hours with a burst transmission that cut through the pre-dawn quiet of forward, operating base sentinel like a blade through silence. Elena was reviewing overnight intelligence reports when the fade-away emergency communication pierced the routine hum of monitoring equipment, carrying the unmistakable urgency of soldiers in immediate danger. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Morrison, transmitted through static and interference that suggested his team was operating at the extreme range of their communication systems. Overwatch Base, this is Recon 7. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Repeat, we are under sustained attack with no viable extraction route. Request immediate support. GPS coordinates follow. Morrison's transmission carried the controlled panic of someone whose training was the only thing preventing complete chaos, as his 12-man reconnaissance unit found themselves trapped in hostile territory with rapidly diminishing options for survival. Elena's training kicked in automatically as she began tracking the incoming coordinates and plotting the team's position on her digital mapping system. The location sent ice through her veins as she realized Morrison's unit was operating in terrain she knew intimately, approximately 15 kilometers inside Syrian territory where tribal boundaries created a complex web of competing authorities and shifting allegiances. The area was notorious for its difficulty in supporting conventional extraction operations due to geographic obstacles and political sensitivities. Major Walsh burst from his office with the kind of urgent energy that had been absent from the intelligence division since Elena's arrival. His usual administrative composure had been replaced by the focused intensity that accompanied genuine crisis situations. The emergency communication had transformed their sterile analytical environment into a command center, where decisions would determine whether 12 American soldiers lived or died. Get me a full tactical assessment of Recon 7's position. Immediately, Walsh commanded, his voice carrying an authority Elena had never heard him display during routine operations. I need terrain analysis, threat evaluation, and extraction options within 15 minutes. Contact Central Command and advise them we have personnel in immediate danger with unknown casualty status. Elena's fingers flew across her keyboard as she compiled intelligence about the region where Morrison's team was trapped. Her analysis drew upon months of detailed study, supplemented by personal knowledge she couldn't officially acknowledge but couldn't ignore when American lives were at stake. The tactical situation was developing exactly as she would have predicted, based on her understanding of local militia capabilities and territorial sensitivities. The reconnaissance unit had been conducting surveillance of suspected weapons caches in an area where 3 different tribal groups maintained overlapping claims of authority. Elena's previous cultural analysis had identified this region as particularly dangerous for American operations because local populations viewed foreign military presence as threatening to their traditional autonomy. Morrison's team had walked into a trap that anyone with cultural awareness could have anticipated and avoided. Communication intercepts confirmed Elena's worst fears as radio traffic revealed coordinated responses from multiple militia groups that had apparently been monitoring American reconnaissance activities for several days. The attack wasn't a random encounter, but a planned ambush that suggested sophisticated intelligence gathering by hostile forces who understood American operational patterns better than American commanders understood local territorial dynamics. Vasquez, I need you to identify all possible extraction routes for Recon 7's current position. Walsh directed, his earlier condescension replaced by recognition that Elena's analytical capabilities might be essential for saving American lives. Factor in terrain obstacles, known hostile positions, and any cultural considerations that might influence local cooperation with extraction efforts. Elena's analysis revealed the brutal reality that conventional extraction options were virtually non-existent. Morrison's team was trapped in a valley surrounded by elevated positions that provided excellent fields of fire for defending forces. Helicopter extraction would require flying through controlled airspace, where surface-to-air missiles had been detected in recent intelligence reports. Ground extraction would require crossing terrain controlled by hostile forces who possessed detailed knowledge of local geography. Lieutenant Colonel Hammond arrived at the intelligence center with the grim expression of someone who understood that 12 American soldiers were counting down their final hours unless someone could find solutions that conventional military thinking hadn't provided. Her presence elevated the urgency of the situation while acknowledging that normal operational procedures were proving inadequate for the crisis at hand. "What's the current status of extraction planning?" Hammond demanded, her voice carrying the weight of command responsibility for personnel whose lives hung in the balance. "I need realistic options, not optimistic scenarios that ignore tactical realities. These soldiers need solutions that can be implemented immediately with available resources." Major Walsh consulted Elena's preliminary analysis before responding with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am, conventional extraction options appear limited by terrain factors and hostile presence in all approach routes. Ground extraction would require fighting through prepared defensive positions, and helicopter extraction faces significant surface-to-air threats that could result in additional casualties." Elena watched Hammond process the implications of Walsh's assessment while studying the tactical maps that displayed Morrison's desperate situation. The lieutenant colonel's expression reflected the terrible calculus of military leadership where impossible decisions had to be made with incomplete information and inadequate resources. Elena recognized the moment when conventional thinking reached its limitations and creative solutions became essential for preventing disaster. "What about unconventional approaches?" Hammond asked, her question suggesting she was beginning to consider options that normal military doctrine didn't address. "Are there alternative methods that might succeed where direct approaches are failing? Local contacts, cultural negotiations, anything that could change the tactical equation?" Elena felt her pulse accelerate as she realized Hammond was indirectly acknowledging that the crisis required exactly the kind of cultural expertise and unconventional thinking that had been dismissed as unsuitable for operational roles. The institutional barriers that had relegated Elena to analytical duties were proving catastrophically inadequate for addressing a situation that demanded intimate understanding of local dynamics. "Ma'am, the region where Recon 7 is trapped involves complex tribal territories where traditional authority structures might provide alternative solutions," Elena said carefully, recognizing that her response could either save 12 lives or end her military career. "The hostile forces aren't motivated by ideological warfare, but by territorial defense against perceived foreign intrusion." Hammond's attention focused sharply on Elena as she realized that someone in the room possessed knowledge that could potentially change the outcome of the crisis. The lieutenant colonel's expression shifted from desperation to calculated assessment as she recognized that conventional military solutions were proving inadequate while unconventional approaches remained unexplored. "Explain what you mean by traditional authority structures," Hammond commanded, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out for Morrison's trapped unit. "What kind of alternative solutions are you suggesting? How could tribal dynamics influence extraction possibilities?" Elena felt the weight of 12 lives pressing against institutional limitations that had confined her to analytical roles while soldiers died because their commanders couldn't understand cultural complexities that she navigated routinely. Her response would either provide hope for Morrison's unit or confirm that American military doctrine was fundamentally inadequate for addressing asymmetric challenges that required cultural sophistication rather than technological superiority. "Ma'am, the tribal groups holding Morrison's unit aren't trying to kill Americans for ideological reasons," Elena explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. They're defending what they consider to be their sovereign territory against foreign military intrusion. Their response follows traditional protocols for managing territorial violations that include established procedures for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than continued warfare. The intelligence center fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Elena's assessment. She was suggesting that 12 American soldiers could potentially be saved through diplomatic negotiation rather than military rescue, an approach that challenged fundamental assumptions about how special operations addressed crisis situations in hostile environments. The secure communication from Central Command crackled through the operations center at 0523 hours, carrying the weight of institutional failure wrapped in military bureaucracy. Lieutenant Colonel Hammond's face grew progressively grimmer as she received updates that confirmed what Elena had feared from the moment Morrison's unit reported their position. The conventional rescue operation had not only failed catastrophically, but had made the tactical situation exponentially worse for everyone involved. "Ma'am, Bravo team encountered heavy resistance during their approach to Recon 7's position," reported the voice from Central Command, each word adding another layer of disaster to an already desperate situation. "We have 3 KIA and 2 missing from the extraction team. The remaining Bravo elements are pinned down approximately 2 kilometers from the original target location, with no immediate support available." Elena felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications of this development. Morrison's 12-man reconnaissance unit was still trapped in hostile territory, but now they were joined by an additional 7 soldiers from the failed rescue attempt. 19 American personnel were effectively surrounded by militia forces that had demonstrated superior knowledge of local terrain and tactical coordination that exceeded American intelligence estimates. Hammond closed her eyes for several seconds, and Elena could see the lieutenant colonel calculating impossible mathematics where every solution required sacrificing some soldiers to potentially save others. The command structure that had relegated Elena to analytical duties was now facing the consequences of institutional blindness that had ignored cultural factors in favor of technological solutions that were proving inadequate for asymmetric warfare. "Central Command is ordering the complete stand-down of rescue operations," Hammond announced to the assembled staff, her voice carrying the bitter edge of someone forced to abandon soldiers under enemy fire. "Risk assessment indicates that additional extraction attempts would likely result in more casualties without improving outcomes for personnel already in contact with hostile forces." Major Walsh stared at the tactical displays showing heat signatures that represented American soldiers fighting for survival while their command structure declared them unreachable. The intelligence officer's administrative competence was useless in a crisis that required creative thinking and cultural understanding that exceeded his analytical capabilities. Elena studied the satellite imagery that was updated in real time, watching thermal signatures that represented 19 American soldiers whose families would soon receive notification that their loved ones had been written off as acceptable losses in an operation that had been doomed from the beginning. The conventional military approach had failed because it ignored cultural dynamics that Elena understood intimately but had never been authorized to influence. "Ma'am, there might be an alternative approach that doesn't require additional military assets," Elena said quietly, recognizing that her suggestion would either save lives or end her career depending on Hammond's willingness to consider options that violated standard operational doctrine. "The tribal groups surrounding our personnel aren't motivated by ideology or hatred of Americans. They're responding to what they perceive as territorial violation according to traditional protocols." Hammond turned toward Elena with the expression of someone who had exhausted conventional options and was willing to consider approaches that normally would be dismissed as inappropriate for military consideration. The lieutenant colonel's desperation was evident, but Elena also recognized genuine intellectual curiosity about solutions that conventional training hadn't prepared her to understand. "Sergeant Vasquez, explain exactly what you're proposing," Hammond commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that unconventional problems sometimes required unconventional solutions. What alternative approach could succeed where direct military action has failed? What do you know about tribal protocols that we haven't considered? Elena felt the weight of 19 lives pressing against institutional barriers that had kept her expertise confined to analytical roles while soldiers died, because their commanders couldn't navigate cultural complexities that required understanding rather than overwhelming force. Her response would determine whether American military doctrine could adapt to challenges that technological superiority couldn't address. "Ma'am, the militia groups holding our personnel follow traditional codes that govern how territorial disputes are resolved," Elena explained, her words carrying the confidence that came from years of studying regional dynamics that conventional military analysis ignored. Their response to foreign intrusion includes established procedures for negotiating prisoner releases that acknowledge territorial sovereignty while allowing face-saving solutions for both parties. The intelligence center buzzed with skeptical murmurs from personnel who had been trained to view negotiation as weakness and cultural accommodation as incompatible with military effectiveness. Elena's proposal challenged fundamental assumptions about how special operations addressed crisis situations, but Hammond's expression suggested she was willing to consider approaches that conventional thinking had dismissed. "You're suggesting diplomatic negotiation with hostile forces that have killed American soldiers and currently hold 19 of our personnel under combat conditions," Hammond said, her tone mixing incredulity with desperate hope. "What makes you believe such negotiations could succeed when military rescue operations have failed?" Elena had anticipated this question and prepared her response carefully, knowing that she would need to demonstrate understanding that went beyond theoretical knowledge of regional customs. Her answer would reveal capabilities that exceeded her current authorization, while potentially providing the only viable solution for bringing American soldiers home alive. "Ma'am, I've studied these tribal groups extensively, and their traditional honor codes include provisions for resolving conflicts through structured negotiations that preserve dignity for all parties," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Their goal isn't to kill Americans, but to demonstrate that their territorial authority must be respected. They're willing to release prisoners if approached correctly." Hammond studied Elena's face with the calculating assessment of someone trying to determine whether this proposal represented genuine expertise or desperate improvisation. The lieutenant colonel's military training emphasized conventional solutions, but her experience included enough asymmetric challenges to recognize that some problems required cultural sophistication rather than technological superiority. "Sergeant, even if your assessment is accurate, we don't have personnel qualified to conduct such negotiations," Hammond said, her words carrying both recognition of Elena's knowledge and acknowledgement that conventional military training hadn't prepared them for diplomatic solutions. Cultural negotiation requires expertise that exceeds standard special operations capabilities. Elena felt her heart rate accelerate as she realized Hammond was inadvertently acknowledging that the crisis required exactly the kind of skills that had been dismissed as incompatible with operational roles. The institutional barriers that had relegated Elena to analytical duties were proving inadequate for addressing challenges that demanded cultural understanding rather than conventional military competence. "Ma'am, I have the cultural knowledge and linguistic capabilities necessary for conducting such negotiations," Elena said, her voice carrying conviction that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "I understand tribal honor codes. I speak fluent Arabic and Kurdish, and I've successfully conducted similar negotiations during previous deployments in comparable situations. The intelligence center fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Elena's offer. She was volunteering to undertake a diplomatic mission that would either save 19 American lives or result in her own death in hostile territory where conventional military support would be impossible. Her proposal challenged institutional assumptions about who was qualified for high-risk operations, while offering the only realistic hope for preventing a complete disaster. Hammond stared at Elena for several seconds before speaking. "Sergeant Vasquez, what you're proposing isn't cultural analysis or intelligence gathering. You're volunteering for an unauthorized solo mission into hostile territory where you would be completely dependent on enemy cooperation for your survival. If these negotiations fail, you would likely be captured or killed with no possibility of military extraction." Elena had considered these risks extensively during the few minutes since Morrison's unit had reported their desperate situation. She understood that volunteering for this mission would either vindicate her years of preparation for exactly this kind of challenge or prove that institutional skepticism about her capabilities had been justified all along. "Ma'am, 19 American soldiers are counting down their final hours while we debate whether unconventional solutions are appropriate for unconventional problems," Elena replied, her words carrying the weight of someone who had found her moment of truth. "I can negotiate their release using cultural protocols that conventional military thinking doesn't understand. Someone has to try, and I'm the only person available who has the necessary expertise." The authorization came wrapped in carefully constructed language that provided Hammond with plausible deniability while giving Elena the minimal official cover she needed for what everyone understood was essentially a suicide mission disguised as intelligence gathering. The orders specified cultural reconnaissance to assess negotiation possibilities with regional tribal leadership, but Elena recognized the bureaucratic fiction for what it was: institutional permission to attempt the impossible when conventional approaches had failed. Catastrophic. Elena moved quickly through the equipment preparation process, selecting gear that would serve dual purposes of demonstrating respect for local customs, while providing minimal protection if diplomatic solutions proved inadequate. Her sidearm remained concealed but accessible. Communication equipment was configured for maximum range, despite anticipated interference, and her uniform displayed no insignia that might be interpreted as threatening by tribal leaders who viewed military symbols as indicators of hostile intent. The intelligence package Elena compiled contained detailed cultural information about the tribal groups holding American personnel, but her real preparation drew upon years of studying regional dynamics that had never been officially acknowledged as militarily relevant. She understood the specific honor codes that governed prisoner treatment, the traditional protocols for approaching tribal elders, and the delicate balance of respect and strength that could mean the difference between successful negotiation and immediate execution. Staff Sergeant Martinez approached as Elena finalized her preparations, his expression carrying the mixture of admiration and concern that characterized how her colleagues viewed her volunteer mission. Martinez had worked with Elena long enough to recognize her capabilities, but he also understood that cultural negotiation in hostile territory involved risks that exceeded conventional combat operations. "Vasquez, I've been thinking about what you're attempting," Martinez said quietly, positioning himself so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by other personnel who might question the wisdom of Elena's approach. "Your cultural knowledge is solid, but these aren't academic negotiations. These tribal leaders have killed American soldiers and currently hold 19 of our people under combat conditions." Elena appreciated Martinez's concern while recognizing that conventional military thinking couldn't fully grasp the diplomatic possibilities that existed within traditional tribal frameworks. Her colleagues understood warfare but not the cultural protocols that could transform enemies into partners when approached with appropriate respect and understanding. "Martinez, I understand the risks, But I also understand that these tribal groups aren't motivated by hatred of Americans. Elena replied, adjusting her equipment while mentally rehearsing the diplomatic approaches she would attempt. They're defending what they consider sovereign territory, according to traditional codes that include provisions for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than continued bloodshed. The vehicle prepared for Elena's mission was stripped of obvious military markings while retaining communication equipment that would allow her to maintain contact with base operations until she entered tribal territory, where radio silence would be essential for demonstrating peaceful intentions. Her route had been planned to approach tribal boundaries through traditional pathways that acknowledged territorial sovereignty, rather than asserting American authority through technological superiority. Lieutenant Colonel Hammond approached with final instructions that carried the weight of someone sending a soldier into circumstances where institutional support would be impossible and survival would depend entirely on individual expertise and cultural understanding. The lieutenant colonel's expression reflected recognition that Elena's mission represented either innovative problem-solving or complete command failure, depending on outcomes that remained impossible to predict. Sergeant Vasquez, understand that once you enter tribal territory, you'll be operating completely outside American military protection, Hammond said, her voice carrying the formal tone of someone providing final authorization for operations that exceeded normal institutional parameters. Your success or failure will depend entirely on your ability to convince hostile forces that cooperation serves their interests better than continued conflict. Elena nodded her understanding while internally acknowledging that her mission would test everything she'd learned about cultural diplomacy against the brutal reality of tribal warfare where mistakes resulted in death rather than academic criticism. Her preparation had been theoretical until this moment, but now she would discover whether years of study could translate into practical solutions for problems that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. The drive toward tribal territory took Elena through a landscape that appeared deceptively peaceful in the morning light, giving no indication of the complex territorial disputes that had made this region a graveyard for foreign military operations. She maintained radio contact with base operations until reaching the final checkpoint where continued communication would compromise the peaceful intentions she needed to demonstrate to tribal leaders who monitored electronic emissions as indicators of hostile intent. Elena's first contact came at a roadblock manned by tribal militia, whose weapons were visible but not immediately threatening, following protocols that allowed for legitimate passage while maintaining defensive readiness. The fighters approached her vehicle with professional caution that suggested military training, combined with cultural awareness of traditional hospitality obligations that governed interactions with foreign visitors. The militia leader was a man whose bearing suggested combat experience combined with authority that came from tribal recognition rather than formal military rank. His evaluation of Elena followed traditional protocols that assessed threat level while acknowledging possibilities for peaceful interaction, creating opportunities for diplomatic engagement that wouldn't exist with ideologically motivated adversaries. You travel alone to speak with tribal elders about prisoners, the leader observed in accented English that demonstrated education beyond what most American intelligence assessments predicted for rural militia leadership. This approach shows either great courage or complete foolishness. Perhaps both qualities serve your purposes. Elena responded in Arabic that acknowledged the leader's authority, while demonstrating respect for cultural protocols that governed formal interactions between representatives of different communities. Her linguistic capabilities immediately shifted the dynamic from potential confrontation toward structured dialogue that followed traditional frameworks for managing territorial disputes. I come seeking wisdom from leaders whose knowledge of justice and honor has guided their people through difficult times, Elena replied, using formal diplomatic language that demonstrated understanding of tribal hierarchy while positioning herself as supplicant rather than demandant. American soldiers entered your territory without proper authorization, and I seek guidance about resolving this situation according to traditional protocols. The militia leader's expression shifted from cautious assessment toward interested calculation as Elena's approach demonstrated cultural sophistication that exceeded his expectations for American military personnel. Her acknowledgement of territorial authority and traditional protocols created possibilities for face-saving solutions that preserved tribal dignity, while addressing practical concerns about prisoner management. Elena was escorted deeper into tribal territory through checkpoints that revealed sophisticated defensive preparations, combined with traditional community structures that had remained unchanged for centuries. The contrast between modern weapons and ancient customs reflected the complex cultural dynamics that American military planning consistently failed to understand or accommodate. The tribal compound where negotiations would occur represented centuries of architectural evolution designed to project authority, while providing security against various threats that had challenged regional autonomy throughout history. Elena recognized the symbolic significance of being granted access to this traditional center of power, understanding that her presence represented either unprecedented diplomatic opportunity or elaborate preparation for execution. Elder Halil Hassan received Elena in a reception room that reflected the careful balance between traditional authority and modern tactical awareness that characterized successful tribal leadership in contested regions. His physical presence commanded immediate respect, while his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had enabled survival through decades of conflict with various foreign forces that had underestimated cultural complexities. American woman, you approach our territory with proper respect and understanding of traditional protocols, Hassan said in English that carried formal precision. This suggests wisdom that has been absent from previous American military interactions. With our people, speak of these prisoners you wish to discuss. Elena felt the weight of 19 lives pressing against this crucial moment, where her cultural preparation would either prove adequate for diplomatic breakthrough or insufficient for preventing complete disaster. Her response would determine whether American soldiers lived or died, based on her ability to navigate tribal honor codes that conventional military training had never prepared her to understand. Elena placed photographs of the 19 captured soldiers on the low table between herself and Elder Hassan, arranging them with deliberate care that demonstrated respect for both the captives and their captors. Each image represented a life hanging in the balance, but she understood that successful negotiation required treating them as individuals with families and stories rather than abstract military assets. Her approach needed to acknowledge the humanity of everyone involved while appealing to traditional concepts of honor that could transform enemies into allies. Elder Hassan, these soldiers are young men who followed orders from leaders who failed to understand the proper protocols for requesting passage through territory governed by ancient law. Elena began, her voice carrying the measured respect that tribal negotiations required. Their presence in your lands was disrespectful, but they acted from ignorance rather than malice. They are sons and fathers whose families wait for their return. Hassan examined each photograph with the careful attention of someone who understood that the faces before him represented more than military casualties. His weathered hands moved slowly across the images while his expression remained neutral, but Elena detected the subtle signs of consideration that suggested her approach was resonating with traditional concepts of mercy and justice that governed tribal decision-making. You speak of families and ignorance, but these soldiers carried weapons into our territory and engaged our defenders in combat, Hassan replied, his words carrying the weight of traditional responsibility for protecting tribal sovereignty. 3 of our young men died defending land their grandfathers have protected. Blood has been spilled, and justice requires acknowledgement of this loss. Elena had anticipated this challenge and prepared her response carefully, understanding that successful negotiation required addressing legitimate grievances while creating pathways for honorable resolution. Her cultural studies had revealed that tribal justice emphasized restoration rather than retribution when appropriate compensation could be offered for damages caused by foreign intrusion. Elder Hassan, I do not minimize the loss your people have suffered, Elena said, her voice carrying genuine respect for tribal casualties, while maintaining focus on finding solutions that served everyone's interests. The deaths of your defenders represent a failure of American leadership to understand the proper way to request passage through sovereign territory. This failure demands acknowledgement and appropriate compensation. Hassan leaned back in his chair, his aged fingers tracing patterns on the armrest while he processed Elena's acknowledgement of tribal sovereignty and American responsibility for the current crisis. Elena recognized the contemplative silence as a positive sign, indicating that her approach was being seriously considered rather than immediately dismissed as inadequate for addressing the magnitude of territorial violation that had occurred. You offer acknowledgement and compensation, but words alone cannot restore life to the dead or heal the wounds inflicted upon our community, Hassan said after several minutes of deliberation. Trust must be demonstrated through actions that carry genuine risk and meaningful sacrifice. What do you propose as a demonstration of American sincerity? Elena felt her pulse quicken as she realized Hassan was testing her commitment to finding solutions that went beyond conventional prisoner exchange negotiations. The elder was demanding proof that American promises carried substance rather than empty diplomatic rhetoric designed to secure tactical advantages without addressing underlying causes of conflict. Elder Hassan, I offer myself as guarantee of American commitment to respecting tribal authority in future operations, Elena replied, her words carrying conviction that surprised her with their certainty. If American leadership fails to honor agreements made in this negotiation, you will know where to find me. My life becomes surety for promises made in my nation's name. Hassan's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting genuine surprise at the scope of Elena's personal commitment to diplomatic resolution. Her offer transformed abstract negotiations into concrete personal responsibility, creating accountability mechanisms that extended beyond official channels into individual honor that traditional tribal culture could understand and respect. You would stake your life on your leader's honesty, Hassan observed, his tone mixing assessment with what might have been approval. This demonstrates understanding of traditional concepts of personal responsibility that have been absent from previous American approaches to our region. But your life alone may not be sufficient guarantee for 19 soldiers and future territorial respect. Elena had prepared for this escalation and understood that Hassan was testing the limits of her commitment while establishing the scope of compensation that would be required for prisoner release. Her response would need to demonstrate both personal courage and practical understanding of what tribal leadership needed to justify mercy toward captured enemies. Elder Hassan, I also offer formal recognition of tribal territorial authority and consultation agreements that would require American forces to seek your permission before conducting operations in this region, Elena said, recognizing that she was promising policy changes that exceeded her authority but might be the only way to save 19 lives. Future American activities would acknowledge tribal sovereignty and include appropriate compensation for any inconvenience caused by foreign presence. Hassan was quiet for several minutes, consulting quietly with other tribal elders who had remained silent during the initial negotiation, but whose input would be essential for any final decision about prisoner release. Elena caught fragments of their rapid discussion in Arabic, understanding enough to recognize that her proposals were being seriously considered, rather than dismissed as inadequate. American woman, your offers have merit, but implementation requires trust that previous American promises have not earned, Hassan finally said, his words carrying the weight of historical experience with foreign commitments that had proven unreliable. Demonstration of good faith must precede prisoner release. You must personally retrieve these soldiers from their current locations and ensure their safe departure from tribal territory. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she processed the implications of Hassan's requirement. He wasn't simply agreeing to release the prisoners in exchange for diplomatic concessions. He was demanding that she personally escort 19 soldiers through hostile territory where any sign of treachery or military deception could result in the immediate execution of everyone involved in the exchange. "Elder Hassan, I accept your terms," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her system. "When do we begin the retrieval process?" Hassan's expression shifted toward something that might have been respected as he realized Elena was willing to risk everything on the success of diplomatic solutions that conventional military thinking had dismissed as impossible. Her acceptance demonstrated the kind of personal courage that tribal culture valued, while creating practical mechanisms for prisoner transfer that preserved dignity for all parties involved. "We begin immediately," Hassan announced, rising from his chair with the deliberate movement of someone whose decisions carried life and death consequences for multiple communities. "The prisoners are held in 3 separate locations that will test your commitment to peaceful resolution. Some of our allied groups may not share my willingness to trust American promises." Elena understood that her real challenges were just beginning. She had successfully negotiated the framework for prisoner release, but implementation would require navigating complex relationships between tribal groups that might have different perspectives on cooperation with American forces. Her success in convincing Hassan was only the first step in a process that would test every aspect of her cultural knowledge and diplomatic skills. The first prisoner holding site emerged from the desert darkness as a collection of traditional mud brick structures that had been reinforced with modern defensive positions, creating a fortress that blended centuries-old architectural wisdom with contemporary tactical requirements. Elena followed Hassan's convoy through checkpoints manned by fighters, whose weapons tracked their movement with professional precision, but their restraint demonstrated respect for their elders' authority over the diplomatic process now underway. Staff Sergeant Morrison and 4 members of his original reconnaissance unit were brought from their holding area in conditions that suggested adherence to traditional codes, governing prisoner treatment rather than the systematic abuse that American intelligence had predicted. They appeared exhausted and dehydrated, but showed no signs of torture or deliberate mistreatment, indicating that tribal honor codes had protected them even during the heat of combat operations. "Ma'am, Sergeant Vasquez?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying disbelief mixed with desperate hope as he recognized Elena, despite the unlikely circumstances of her presence in enemy territory. "Are you here officially? Is there an extraction team standing by?" Elena met Morrison's eyes directly while choosing her words carefully, understanding that her response would either maintain morale or create panic among soldiers whose survival depended on their continued cooperation with the diplomatic process she had initiated. Her authority in this situation came from cultural expertise rather than military rank, but Morrison's men needed leadership that projected confidence in their eventual safe return. "Morrison, I'm here to bring you and your men home," Elena replied, avoiding questions about official authorization while providing the reassurance that captured soldiers needed to maintain hope during an extraction process that would test everyone's endurance and commitment. "We have agreements in place for your release, but implementation requires careful coordination with tribal leadership." Hassan observed the interaction between Elena and the captured soldiers with the sharp attention of someone evaluating whether American promises could be trusted when tested by practical implementation challenges. His assessment would influence not only the immediate success of prisoner transfers but also the long-term viability of diplomatic cooperation between tribal authorities and American military forces operating in the region. The second location required a 2-hour journey through terrain that revealed the sophisticated defensive networks tribal militias had established throughout their traditional territories. Elena recognized tactical innovations that combined traditional knowledge of local geography with modern military techniques, creating defensive capabilities that had proven superior to American technological advantages in asymmetric warfare. Environments. Lieutenant Chun and 6 soldiers from the failed rescue operation were held in a compound controlled by a different tribal faction whose cooperation with Hassan's diplomatic initiative reflected complex alliance structures that American intelligence had consistently failed to understand. Elena's presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, suggesting that her success would depend on Hassan's influence rather than her own diplomatic skills. The tribal subleader, Mahmoud al-Rashid, received Elena with formal courtesy that masked obvious skepticism about American commitments to honoring agreements that required substantial changes in military operational procedures. His questions probed the practical implementation of diplomatic promises while testing Elena's understanding of tribal honor codes that governed intergroup cooperation. Hassan speaks of American recognition of territorial sovereignty, but your aircraft violate our airspace daily without permission, al-Rashid observed, his words carrying a challenge that demanded specific responses rather than general diplomatic assurances. Your soldiers conduct operations in our lands without consultation or compensation. Why should we believe these violations will cease? Elena had anticipated this challenge and prepared responses that addressed practical concerns, while acknowledging legitimate grievances that had created the current crisis. Her answer needed to demonstrate understanding of tribal perspectives, while offering concrete mechanisms for preventing future conflicts through established consultation procedures. Commander al-Rashid, you identify exactly the problems that current agreements are designed to address, Elena replied, using his formal title to demonstrate respect for his authority while positioning her proposals as solutions to existing problems rather than additional burdens. Recognition of territorial sovereignty means American operations would require your explicit permission. Consultation procedures would provide compensation for any inconvenience caused by approved activities. Al-Rashid studied Elena's face while processing her response through the calculating assessment of someone whose survival had depended on accurate evaluation of foreign promises that often proved worthless when tested by changing political circumstances. His decision would determine whether Chun's unit joined the prisoner exchange or remained hostages to tribal skepticism about American diplomatic reliability. The third location presented Elena's most dangerous challenge as she encountered a tribal group whose leader had not participated in Hassan's initial negotiations and whose cooperation remained uncertain despite Hassan's personal guarantee of safe passage. Elder Yusuf Qasimi commanded fighters whose recent losses to American military operations had created emotional barriers to diplomatic cooperation that transcended traditional honor codes governing prisoner treatment. 8 soldiers from both the original reconnaissance mission and the failed rescue attempt were held in conditions that reflected their captors' anger rather than adherence to traditional protocols governing prisoner welfare. Elena recognized signs of deliberate intimidation designed to break morale and create compliance that exceeded military necessity, suggesting that Qasimi's group viewed the captured Americans as instruments for revenge rather than diplomatic leverage. Hassan brings an American woman who speaks of honor and agreements, while your forces continue killing our people in other regions, Qasimi announced, his voice carrying the bitter edge of someone whose personal losses had exceeded his willingness to consider peaceful solutions. Why should we release valuable prisoners when your military treats our communities as targets for elimination? Elena realized that Qasimi's resistance reflected broader patterns of American military operations that had created cumulative grievances extending far beyond the immediate territorial dispute that had trapped Morrison's unit. Her diplomatic approach would need to address systematic problems while acknowledging individual losses that had personal meaning for tribal leadership. Elder Kasimi, I cannot undo past tragedies or restore life to the dead, Elena said, her voice carrying genuine respect for his losses while maintaining focus on preventing additional casualties through diplomatic cooperation. But I can offer assurance that future operations will include consultation with tribal leadership to prevent the civilian casualties that have caused unnecessary suffering for your people. Kasimi's expression revealed internal struggle between traditional obligations to show mercy toward defeated enemies and personal desire for revenge against forces that had caused his community to suffer losses that exceeded acceptable parameters. Elena understood that her success would depend on appealing to tribal honor codes that emphasized restoration over retribution when appropriate compensation could be arranged. The negotiation continued for 3 hours as Elena systematically addressed each of Kasimi's concerns while Hassan provided cultural translation that helped both parties understand perspectives that conventional military thinking had never attempted to bridge. Elena's stamina was tested by diplomatic complexity that required sustained attention to cultural nuances that could determine whether 8 American soldiers lived or died. When Kasimi finally agreed to prisoner release, Elena felt the overwhelming relief of someone who had successfully navigated the most dangerous diplomatic challenge of her career, while recognizing that her mission remained incomplete until all 19 soldiers reached safety beyond tribal territorial boundaries. Convoy carrying 19 liberated American soldiers wound through desert terrain as dawn broke over the Syrian landscape. But Elena understood that reaching tribal territorial boundaries represented only the beginning of challenges that would determine whether her diplomatic breakthrough translated into lasting change or remained an isolated success story. The rescued soldiers maintained discipline despite their exhaustion, but their expressions reflected amazement that their extraction had been accomplished through negotiation rather than the military force they had expected. Staff Sergeant Morrison rode in the lead vehicle beside Elena, his questions revealing the disconnect between conventional military thinking and the cultural diplomacy that had secured their release. His tactical training had prepared him for combat extraction scenarios, but provided no framework for understanding how enemy forces could be transformed into cooperative partners through proper acknowledgement of their legitimate concerns and territorial authority. "Ma'am, I'm trying to understand what happened back there," Morrison said, his voice carrying confusion mixed with gratitude as he processed the diplomatic complexity that had prevented what seemed like certain death for his entire unit. "Those tribal leaders were treating you like some kind of official representative, but I know you're assigned to intelligence analysis. How did you have authority to negotiate our release?" Elena chose her words carefully, understanding that Morrison's questions reflected broader institutional confusion about how cultural expertise could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. Her success had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded her official authorization, creating professional complications that would require careful navigation once they returned to forward operating base Sentinel. Morrison, the authority came from understanding that some problems required different solutions than standard military approaches provide. Elena replied, avoiding specifics about her unauthorized mission while focusing on the tactical lessons that could benefit future operations. Those tribal leaders weren't motivated by hatred of Americans, but by legitimate concerns about territorial sovereignty that could be addressed through proper diplomatic recognition. The rescued soldiers exchanged glances that suggested Elena's explanation raised more questions than it answered, but their gratitude for successful extraction outweighed their confusion about unconventional methods that had achieved results when conventional approaches had failed catastrophically. Their survival had depended on cultural expertise that military training had never emphasized, creating cognitive dissonance that would influenced their understanding of asymmetric warfare for the remainder of their careers. Lieutenant Chun approached Elena during a brief stop to verify communication procedures, his expression reflecting the mixture of professional respect and personal bewilderment that characterized how most personnel reacted to her diplomatic achievements. Chun's tactical knowledge was extensive, but his recent experience as a prisoner had demonstrated the limitations of conventional military thinking when confronted with cultural challenges that required understanding rather than overwhelming force. Sergeant Vasquez, what you accomplished back there goes beyond anything they teach at the War College, Chun said quietly, positioning himself so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by other soldiers who might question the institutional implications of Elena's success. You negotiated with hostile forces that had killed American soldiers and somehow convinced them to release prisoners they had every strategic reason to keep. Elena appreciated Chun's recognition while understanding that her diplomatic breakthrough would create institutional discomfort among senior leaders who had dismissed cultural approaches as incompatible with military effectiveness. Her success challenged fundamental assumptions about how special operations addressed asymmetric challenges, potentially forcing recognition that diversity of thought was more valuable than uniformity of method. The radio communication with forward operating base Sentinel carried undertones of disbelief as Elena reported successful completion of prisoner extraction through diplomatic means rather than military rescue operations. Major Walsh's voice reflected confusion about how to classify an unauthorized mission that had achieved strategic success through methods that violated standard operational doctrine while saving lives that conventional approaches had written off as acceptable casualties. Overwatch Base, this is Vasquez. All 19 personnel are secure and proceeding to extraction coordinates. Estimated arrival at primary checkpoint is 0847 hours. Request medical evaluation teams and debriefing preparation for returning personnel. Elena transmitted, using official language that masked the revolutionary implications of her diplomatic achievement. The response from base operations carried careful neutrality that suggested senior leadership was struggling to process the institutional ramifications of Elena's success. Her unauthorized mission had not only saved American lives, but had also established diplomatic precedents that could transform how military forces operated in culturally complex environments, where technological superiority wasn't sufficient for achieving strategic objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Hammond's voice came through Elena's personal communication channel with the measured tone of someone who understood that Elena's achievement would require careful institutional management to prevent career consequences for everyone involved in authorizing an unauthorized mission that had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Vasquez, outstanding work bringing our people home, Hammond said, her words carrying genuine admiration mixed with obvious concern about the bureaucratic complications that would inevitably follow Elena's diplomatic breakthrough. Be prepared for extensive debriefing sessions that will focus on operational methods as much as strategic outcomes. Your approach has implications that extend far beyond this immediate situation. Elena understood that Hammond was warning her about institutional scrutiny that would examine not only the tactical details of prisoner negotiation but also the broader question of whether cultural expertise deserved recognition as a legitimate military capability rather than an auxiliary support function. Her success had demonstrated possibilities that challenged existing hierarchies and could either revolutionize military thinking or be dismissed as exceptional circumstances that didn't warrant systematic implementation. The checkpoint marking tribal territorial boundaries appeared as a collection of concrete barriers and guard positions that had been established through coordination between Elena's diplomatic agreements and American military requirements for secure prisoner transfer. The symbolic significance of American soldiers crossing from hostile territory into friendly control represented validation of diplomatic approaches that conventional wisdom had deemed impossible. Elena watched the rescued soldiers process their transition from captivity to freedom, while recognizing that her own transition would be more complex and potentially more dangerous than anything she had faced during tribal negotiations. Her diplomatic success had exceeded her official authority and challenged institutional assumptions that would require defense through political channels that operated according to different rules than cultural diplomacy. Staff Sergeant Martinez waited at the checkpoint with the expression of someone who had monitored Elena's mission through communication intercepts that revealed the scope of her achievement without providing context for understanding how unauthorized diplomatic initiatives had succeeded where conventional military operations had failed. His greeting carried professional respect, mixed with amazement that bordered on disbelief. "Vasquez, when you left base yesterday, nobody thought you'd be coming back, let alone bringing 19 soldiers with you," Martinez said, his voice reflecting the mixture of admiration and confusion that would characterize institutional responses to Elena's unprecedented achievement. "What you accomplished out there is going to change how people think about cultural operations and diplomatic solutions." Elena appreciated Martinez's recognition while understanding that institutional change would depend on whether senior leadership possessed the wisdom to acknowledge that her success represented replicable methodology rather than exceptional circumstances that couldn't be systematically implemented. Her diplomatic breakthrough had created opportunities for revolutionary change in military thinking, but implementation would require overcoming institutional resistance that preferred familiar failures to unfamiliar successes. 6 months later, Elena stood before a joint session of Congress wearing the Medal of Honor that President Harrison had personally pinned to her uniform, during a ceremony that acknowledged not only her individual courage, but also the fundamental transformation in military doctrine that her success had catalyzed. The same cultural negotiation protocols that institutional leadership had dismissed as too unconventional for operational consideration were now being implemented across every theater where American forces encountered complex tribal dynamics and asymmetric challenges. The congressional hearing room buzzed with the controlled energy that accompanied historic testimony about military innovations that challenged traditional assumptions about how democratic nations should conduct operations in culturally complex environments. Elena's presence represented more than individual recognition. She embodied proof that diversity of thought and approach could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military doctrine had been unable to address through technological superiority alone. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Armed Services Committee, opened the hearing with remarks that acknowledged the broader implications of Elena's achievement for American foreign policy and military effectiveness in regions where cultural understanding proved more valuable than overwhelming firepower. The senator's introduction emphasized that Elena's success had prevented not only immediate casualties but also long-term diplomatic complications that could have destabilized entire regions. Sergeant First Class Vasquez, your actions in Syria demonstrated that some military challenges require solutions that conventional training doesn't provide, Senator Williams said, her voice carrying the formal respect that congressional proceedings demanded while acknowledging the revolutionary nature of Elena's diplomatic breakthrough. Your success saved 19 American lives while establishing precedents for cooperation that have prevented conflicts across multiple regions. Elena had prepared extensively for congressional testimony that would focus on replicable methodology rather than individual heroism, understanding that lasting institutional change required demonstrating that cultural diplomacy represented systematic capability rather than exceptional circumstances that couldn't be incorporated into standard military doctrine. Her testimony would influence policy decisions that affected thousands of personnel operating in environments where cultural awareness could determine mission success or failure. Senator Williams, the 19 soldiers rescued through tribal negotiation, represent validation of approaches that emphasize understanding over assumptions. Elena replied, her voice carrying the confidence that came from proven success in situations where conventional methods had failed catastrophically. Military effectiveness in culturally complex environments requires personnel who understand that strength sometimes appears different than traditional expectations suggest. The hearing room included representatives from multiple government agencies whose operations had been influenced by Elena's diplomatic innovations, creating an audience that understood the practical implications of cultural competence for achieving strategic objectives without creating long-term complications that exceeded immediate tactical gains. Elena's testimony would shape policies that determined how American forces approached asymmetric challenges in regions where technological advantages weren't sufficient for achieving lasting success. General Marcus Thompson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, provided context for Elena's achievement within broader strategic frameworks that emphasized sustainable solutions over short-term tactical victories. His presence demonstrated institutional recognition that Elena's methods represented systematic innovation, rather than isolated success that couldn't be replicated through proper training and cultural preparation. The diplomatic protocols developed by Sergeant Vasquez have been implemented across 7 different operational theaters with consistent success in reducing casualties while achieving strategic objectives. General Thompson testified, his words carrying the weight of institutional validation that Elena's critics could no longer dismiss as exceptional circumstances. Cultural competence has proven more effective than conventional approaches for managing complex tribal dynamics that influence regional stability. Elena watched congressional representatives process the implications of systematic success that challenged fundamental assumptions about how military force should be applied in environments where local cooperation determined long-term outcomes. Her individual achievement had catalyzed institutional transformation that extended far beyond her personal career advancement, creating opportunities for other personnel whose cultural expertise had been undervalued by traditional military hierarchies. Representative David Chun raised questions about resource allocation for cultural training programs that would prepare future personnel to replicate Elena's diplomatic success in situations where conventional military approaches proved inadequate for achieving sustainable solutions. His inquiries reflected congressional understanding that Elena's methods required institutional investment rather than relying on exceptional individuals to overcome systemic limitations. Sergeant Vasquez, what specific training components would be necessary for preparing other personnel to conduct similar negotiations in culturally complex environments? Representative Chun asked, his question emphasizing practical implementation rather than theoretical possibilities that might not translate into operational capability. Elena had anticipated this question and prepared comprehensive responses that outlined systematic approaches to cultural competence development that could be incorporated into existing training frameworks without requiring complete restructuring of military education systems. Her recommendations emphasized practical skills that could be developed through focused preparation rather than innate characteristics that couldn't be systematically replicated. Representative Chun, effective cultural negotiation requires linguistic capability, historical understanding of regional dynamics, and most importantly, recognition that different cultural frameworks can produce solutions that conventional military thinking doesn't anticipate. Elena explained, her response emphasizing teachable skills rather than exceptional personal characteristics that couldn't be systematically developed. The testimony continued for 3 hours, as Elena fielded questions that revealed congressional understanding of her achievements' implications for American foreign policy and military effectiveness in regions where cultural competence determined strategic success. Her responses demonstrated not only personal expertise, but also systematic thinking about how diplomatic innovations could be institutionalized rather than remaining dependent on exceptional individuals. Elder Hassan had traveled to Washington for the ceremony, becoming the first tribal leader to address Congress about military cooperation between traditional authorities and modern democratic institutions. His presence represented unprecedented diplomatic recognition that validated Elena's cultural approach while establishing formal frameworks for consultation that prevented future conflicts through structured dialogue rather than military confrontation. Sergeant Vasquez demonstrated that American military personnel could approach our traditions with respect rather than dismissal. Hassan testified, his words carrying the authority of someone whose cooperation had prevented regional conflicts that could have destabilized multiple nations. Her understanding created possibilities for cooperation that benefits both American strategic interests and traditional community autonomy. The ceremony concluded with Elena's promotion to Master Sergeant and assignment to lead the newly created Cultural Operations Division, institutionalizing approaches that had been dismissed as incompatible with military effectiveness, until her success forced recognition that diversity of method enhanced rather than compromised operational capability. Her new position would influence policy development and training programs that prepared personnel for asymmetric challenges, requiring cultural sophistication rather than overwhelming force. Colonel Torres, who had originally questioned Elena's suitability for operational roles, now served as her deputy in developing cultural competence programs that were being implemented across multiple commands. His presence represented institutional acknowledgement that previous assessments had been based on assumptions rather than evidence, creating opportunities for systematic transformation that extended beyond individual career advancement. Elena's proudest moment came when Specialist Maria Santos approached after the ceremony, carrying documentation for cultural operations training that had been inspired by Elena's diplomatic breakthrough. Santos represented the next generation of personnel who would enter military service with institutional support for cultural competence rather than facing systematic barriers that had limited Elena's advancement until her unauthorized mission forced recognition of capabilities that conventional thinking had dismissed. "Ma'am, I've been studying your negotiation techniques and cultural analysis methods," Santos said, her voice carrying determination that reminded Elena of her own commitment to proving that alternative approaches could achieve strategic objectives that conventional methods couldn't address. "When they said certain types of people couldn't handle special operations, you demonstrated that some operations require exactly the perspectives that traditional thinking excludes." Elena smiled, remembering her father's words about preparing for moments that test everything you believe about service and sacrifice. The most important victories aren't always achieved through conventional warfare, but sometimes through people who understand that true strength includes knowing when diplomacy serves strategic interests better than force, when cultural understanding achieves more than technological superiority, and when listening accomplishes what intimidation cannot. Elena smiled, remembering her father's words about preparing for moments that test everything you believe about service and sacrifice. The most important victories aren't always achieved through conventional warfare, but sometimes through people who understand that true strength includes knowing when diplomacy serves strategic interests better than force, when cultural understanding achieves more than technological superiority, and when listening accomplishes what intimidation cannot. As she walked through the Pentagon corridors, now lined with photographs documenting successful cultural operations worldwide, Elena reflected on how dismissal had become her greatest preparation. Every moment of being underestimated had sharpened her resolve to prove that perceived weaknesses could become extraordinary strengths when the right moment demanded unconventional solutions. The 19 soldiers she'd brought home weren't just Survivors, they were living proof that someone willing to risk everything for principles others dismissed could change the world. Their families sent letters expressing gratitude for a rescue that seemed impossible until someone refused to accept that impossible meant UNACHIEVABLE. Today, Elena trains the next generation of cultural operators, teaching them that being called backup might actually mean you're being prepared for the moment, when everyone else's methods fail and only your unique perspective can save lives. She shows them that sometimes the greatest honor comes not from fitting traditional expectations, but from proving that excellence takes many forms. Your story of overcoming impossible odds is waiting to be discovered. What challenge have you faced where everyone doubted your abilities until you proved them wrong? Share your moment of vindication in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. If Elena's journey from dismissed backup to Medal of Honor recipient inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes who refuse to accept limitations others place on their potential. Remember, sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimated. What impossible mission is waiting for someone brave enough to try a different approach? Your moment might be closer than you think.